Chapter 7. The Tea Trade at Lloyd's. Lloyd's Coffee House was then housed at number 16 Lombard Street, before its activity was moved to the Royal Exchange. It was much as you should imagine, a smallish cafe, choked with tobacco smoke, and stuffed full with little tables and chairs, and altogether too many patrons. In those days, coffee-houses were still democratic societies, and men of rank were prohibited from requiring tradesmen or the lower gentry from giving up their seat. I barged in through the front door before I was detained and required to divulge an admission fee of 1 pence. I called for coffee, put my nose into a newspaper, and tried my best to look inconspicuous. But try as I did, a man dressed as the Lord Marbury can no more go unnoticed at Lloyd's than the risen Christ could have remained inconspicuous at Cambuslang. It was not 20 minutes before I was recognized.
"Heavens! I do believe it is the Master Marbury,"
called a scrawny old gentleman seated at the table next to me. He introduced himself as Louis Archibald, 2nd Baronet of Newcastle. How that stately baronet returns to me as I write this. His face was painted like a halfpenny whore, his wig nearly thrice the size of his head, and he held a sprig of juniper berries before his nose and face, as great a macaroni as I had ever met in my life. I tipped my hat, confirmed that I was the Lord Marbury, and was thereafter requested to join the baronet at table. The baronet caused an introduction to his companion, a Mr. Phipps, a rather stern-looking fellow, dressed in all black, and though he gave a nod, he quickly returned to his newspapers.
"Do you know, Lord Marbury, that only last month I spent a most enjoyable evening with your sister, the Marchioness of Somerset," said the baronet. "I was staying with the Howards at Carlton Towers for the Wicklow."
The baronet rambled on about an afternoon's entertainments.
"Of course, I do not hunt, and so we ladies spent the afternoon at tea. Myself, and the Marchioness, and the Marquess of Buckingham, and the Lady Ashby, who is married to the Bishop of Kent, and her 2 daughters, Philippa and Philomene, and there was the Duchess of Kent and her sister, the Baroness of Sussex, though I'm sure you've heard of the scandal within the House of Sussex."
Archibald gave a devious smile, and explained that certain letters had been found between Sussex's mother and a Lieutenant Alfred of the King's 7th Fusiliers, revealing a tumultuous love affair.
"And would you believe that rather than destroying the letters, the Baron's younger brother published the beastly things, and is now threatening to seek legal recourse to have his elder brother declared a bastard, and seize the baronetcy for himself? I've never heard of such a scandal. But I'm told Parliament won't allow it. And besides, even if Parliament was allowed to conduct an investigation, there are no witnesses because the lieutenant later died in India, of malaria, I think, or perhaps it was dropsy. In any event, the Countess of Darlington and her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess of Rutland, and of course Mr. Grenfell's wife, were all there too."
I could tell this Earl was a great man for genealogy, and had excellent connections in the highest circles.
"But of course your sister's husband is a monstrous commoner," laughed the baronet. "I met him as he returned from the hunt, and we were all appalled by his appearance. Such a common-looking fellow, and your sister, such a delicate beauty. I believe his father was a grocer. Yes, I'm sure I heard that. Is that right? And yet his lordship, yes, consented to the marriage. The grocer's son must surely be rich. Or is he the grocer's grandson? I think that is important. Very important, in fact. And of course, whatever else one may say of the trade, I am told there is good money to be made in grocering."
It was fortunate that this baronet did not require very much from me, except the occasional confirmation or denial. "Just so," I would say, or else, "I don't believe it happened just that way."
"And yet we were all shocked when we heard that your father had settled upon the couple the estate at Tring Park. But it is rather a garish place, I think. I had heard there were plans to sell it to Mr. Rothschild. Do you know Mr. Rothschild? I've not met him, though everyone suspects your father is grossly indebted to him for the South Sea debacle. Do you know that when the Spectator ran the article about your father's financial troubles, I wrote a letter to the editor complaining of the treatment of so eminent a figure? I did. I swear it. But he never published a thing. But Tring Park, I think it is rather a hideous place, perhaps the worst of the county houses. Was it designed by Mr. Wren? And what a silly accent you have, said the baronet, sipping his coffee and moving on to new subjects. I'm quite certain that I'd heard you were living on the continent. Or was it America? Have you gone to the New World? I think it is most exciting.
I confirm that I had indeed been travelling on the continent, and in America too, and thence explained to the baronet that while I had been travelling, I had contracted with a tea merchant from Boston to import the commodity into the New World. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Phipps, whose curiosity was now excited in our conversation. He put down his newspaper and gave me a stern look. "Are you trading for tea, then?" "To be sure," said I. "I am, in fact, just today to the auction to procure for my investors a shipment of not less than 15 tons of Indian kaolin." "For the colonists, then?" asked Mr. Phipps. "Indeed," I replied. 10 tons, you say?" said Mr. Phipps. "I've been watching the tea prices all week, but you say that you intend to purchase at market. You have no contracts now to redeem?" "No, sir, I intend to purchase at auction," said I. Yes, there's plenty of time for all that," laughed the baronet, and swatted away Mr. Phipps's interest like a horsefly. His voice then fell into a whisper, and he cupped my ear for a piece of private conversation. "But tell me, Lord Marbury, I heard a vicious rumour of the reason for your so recent sojourn. Coitus with your manservant. Is it so? Can it be so? Why, I think it is simply marvellous. Rapport sexuel avec notre serviteur." I felt obliged to defend the honour of Lord Marbury, but it seemed to me that this baronet had a rather devious sense of wit, and so I consented to humour him. "Ah, yes, the coitus." I slapped the baronet on the back to show him I knew us to be equals. I fear I was rather indiscreet with my manservant, and the poor sop could not keep it in his mouth. So for the present I shall have to make my own way. "Lord Marbury," said the quivering baronet, and fanned himself with a Chinese wand, "I do believe we shall become very good friends. C'est un ami de la chambre au cocher." It was then, I recall, that another enormous fellow, a Mr. Amesbury, I was to learn, burst through the front door in a great commotion, and waddled up to our table like a walrus attending the opera. He removed his hat, threw it upon the table, and fell heavily into a wooden chair next to Mr. Phipps and the flamboyant baronet. His face was hot with sweat, and his wig, though clearly of the highest fashion, was yet sliding off his bald head from lack of paste and glue. "I am ruined, gentlemen," said Mr. Amesbury, and placed his fingers under his wig and scratched violently at his bald head. "Ruined by this abominable duty." Mr. Amesbury explained that he had only then returned from his solicitors, who informed him that his appeal of his tax for the windows in his new home in Tyburn Lane had been rejected, and that he had been assessed the full duty under the law. £6 4 for windows, sir, for nothing more than enjoying the light and air that is God's alone, sir." "Nonsense, sir," said Mr. Phipps, who peered out from his newspaper to chastise his companion. "I know to a certainty that you grossed £32,000 last year. You can afford twopence for windows, sir." "Twopence, sir?" cried Mr. Amesbury. "'Tis nowhere near a twopence. 'Tis £6 4 I tried to keep my attention upon the subject of the window tax, hoping thereby to endear myself to these prosperous gentlemen, but my attention was at times diverted by the baronet. His Grace was much impressed by the finery of my hosiery, and could not keep his hands off my personage. He enjoyed stroking and pulling his fingers across the very fine stitching and very fine buttons, and then began to play with the curls in my hair, and then feel the velvet lining on my waistcoat. I allowed him liberty, as one man of fashion to another, and he demonstrated his appreciation by complimenting not only my costume, but also my scent.
"An amorous looking-glass! 'Tis not an amorous looking-glass, sir!" shouted Mr. Amesbury, whose protestation roused me from my intimacy with the baronet. "But merely a window, a wondrous orifice through which honest residents may receive air and light and sunshine."
"Is my home not filled with light and air?" rejoined Mr. Phipps, making a great show of his position on the matter with his hands. "Where have I condemned the light and air? No, sir, I have condemned the decadence of the window, and the effeminacy that must accompany their multiplication."
"And how do you intend to keep out the ice and sleet in winter?" laughed Mr. Amesbury. "Are we to imagine that you allow snow to fill up your rooms in Park Lane?"
"No, sir," said Mr. Phipps. "I am no savage. In winter I board up the holes in my wall with flattened cow-horn, as a gentleman have done since the days of good King Henry." Mr. Amesbury seemed stopped by this retort, and his face grew heavy with heat, and puffed up in a great shade of scarlet.
"You have obscured the subject, sir," said Mr. Amesbury. "We are not discussing the morality of the window, but only the tyrannical duty imposed upon the king's subjects."
"No, sir," cried Mr. Phipps. "It is the duty, sir. The duty is the concern, sir. The duty. If you wish to turn your house into a whoredome of stained glass and feather beds, you, sir, shall be compelled to pay the duty."
"My lord," said Mr. Amesbury to the baronet, "you are in agreement with me, are you not? The lords know this tax is an unpardonable violence against the people."
The baronet quite agreed with Mr. Amesbury.
"Oh, yes, indeed. I have heard many a high lord condemn the window duty." "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Amesbury,
feeling himself triumphant over Mr. Phipps.
"This illegality, the wanton confiscation of our rights and property, that is the issue upon which you must concern yourself, Mr. Phipps. I have here the opinion of the Lord Commissioner. Will you have it, sir?"
But Mr. Phipps said he would not have the opinion.
"You will have the opinion, sir,"
cried Mr. Amesbury, who began sifting through his papers on the table.
"I have it right here. Wait, just a moment. I will read it to you gentlemen, and you shall hear how the king's ministers have turned the law from the service of the king's subjects into a tool of oppression."
Mr. Amesbury thence found the paper, and began to recite from the magistrate's opinion.
"Let it be known to all who so choose to examine that the occupant of number 12 Tyburn Lane has been found liable in the amount of £6 and 4 shillings in accordance with His Majesty's law, known to all his subjects as the Act granting His Majesty rates and duties upon houses for making good the deficiency of clipped money. Each of the appellant's arguments is hereby rejected for cause and found unlawful by this Commission. Argument the first is hereby rejected in its entirety. For although it be true that rooms which are not accustomed to habitation are not liable under the tax, more is required than the shameful appendage of the word cheese room above the doorframe. And furthermore, contrary to appellant's contention that the definition of a cheese room is not simply a room that has cheese in it, where cheese may lay and ripen and be ready to be consumed by the residents and guests of the manor. Instead, a cheese room is and must only be a room whose entire purpose and essence is devoted to the ripening, preparation, and culturizing of cheese. That if any room which has cheese in it also be used for music or drawing or entertaining, that room cannot also be called a cheese room, but instead must be called a drawing room or a music room, according to its purpose. And any windows through which light may be received into that room shall and must be taxed at 2 shillings. What say you, sir?"
Mr. Amesbury asked Mr. Phipps.
"Will you condemn this theft sanctioned by law, this gross illegality, and be counted?"
"I will do no such thing," replied Mr. Phipps. "I think it a reasonable finding, and I wonder that you are not ashamed for having contrived so juvenile an attempt to evade the king's law."
"Part a second!"
shouted Mr. Amesbury, his face growing ever redder and hotter under his collar.
"That the so assessed window, appearing from the second floor of the north-east corner of the house at 16 Tyburn Lane, is indeed a window, and not a miniature door made of glass and worsted pig iron.
The Commission is unpersuaded by the appellant's contention, so wanting in sincerity, that the threat of fire compelled the architect to design this miniature door, through which occupants might escape the heat and danger of giant flames. For though the threat of fire may be great, and the danger real to life and limb, this threat alone cannot transform a sheet of rectangular glass from a window into a miniature door. That simply the King's English is not so elastic or wanting in integrity to permit this violence upon our beloved language. What say you, sir? Will you now acknowledge the tyranny and be counted?
But Mr. Phipps said that he only counted the solicitor's integrity on a par with a dancing master, and the architect's ingenuity on par with a Hottentot. Mr. Amesbury stood aghast at this condemnation, and suddenly there erupted great shouting as the conversation descended into a most cantankerous row, now denouncing the window duty, now condemning the Whig party, now chastising some Uncle Buckingham, and now critiquing the war with France.
"My lord!"
shouted Mr. Amesbury, and beseeched the baronet,
"I beg you to inform Mr. Phipps that his appeasement of tyranny is counted."
The baronet, whose hands by this time had found their way deep inside the pockets of my shag-vest, nodded in agreement.
"Thank you, sir,"
said Mr. Amesbury to the baronet, who was now determined to take the conversation back from Mr. Phipps.
"The defining characteristic of an Englishman is his liberty, as dear and sacred to him as wings are to a bird, or massive jaws are to a crocodile. Thus, to impose upon an Englishman a duty to which he has not consented is to thus deprive him of his essence. To emasculate him before the eyes of the law and the Commonwealth, in effect, it is a public castration of his rights and privileges. Shall we allow it?"
"Never, sir!" shouted the baronet, who stood firmly with Mr. Amesbury regarding the window duty.
"Consider, sir, that tyranny has often been established without law, and sometimes against it, but the history of mankind does not produce another instance in which it has been established by law. It is an audacious outrage upon civil government, and if allowed to, will devour the virility of all Englishmen. Are we in agreement, my lord?"
"Hear, hear!" cried the baronet, who thence began to work himself into a great enthusiasm.
"Thank you, my lord,"
Mr. Amesbury continued.
"And how stands the law today? Righteousness is everywhere in retreat. Liberty is hunted. The law conspires with villainy to make erect a monstrous and vile tyranny. This parliament of highwaymen have replaced the king's sceptre with a despot's rod, which is now being used to violate the innermost cavities of all Englishmen."
Cheers from the baronet.
"Shall we be penalised for our love of liberty and our hatred of tyranny?"
roared Mr. Amesbury.
"Nay, we lovers of liberty and enemies of wanton punishment, we liberphiles, we penal phobes, we must resist that oppression which seeks to deprive us of our essence. What says the baronet?"
"I am counted a penal phile," said the baronet, whose devotion to liberty and contempt for tyranny at that moment could not be bettered by Mr. Thomas Paine himself.
"Counted!"
cried Mr. Amesbury.
"The noble baronet is counted for liberty. And what does this liberty oppose? Tyranny, sir. Not only is this an idle tyranny, but an active and pulsating tyranny."
"Pulsating and overwhelming," cried the baronet, who now seized upon my bulbous thigh muscle and began gyrating in his seat. His face was hot with sweat, so possessed was he by a love of liberty.
"Thank you, sir,"
cried Mr. Amesbury.
"It is a despotism, secreting the basest and vilest seeds of disharmony, discontent, and disorder. Seeds that are now spilling over onto these blessed shores of Albion. What says the baronet?"
"Oh, vile seeds!" cried the baronet, who shoved his fingers into his mouth at this very moment, and began stomping his feet repeatedly on the floor. "They must be loosed, though it violates nature." "Control yourself, Archibald," interrupted Mr. Phipps, shaking his head in fury and pounding his fist upon the table. "This is a commercial coffee-house, not one of your dens for he-strumpets." The baronet was thence dislodged from his intoxication, and wiped his forehead with a very fine silken handkerchief. "Oh, forgive me, gentlemen. I was most taken with the protestations of Mr. Amesbury." "And you, sir," said Mr. Phipps, and pointed a long finger in the face of Mr. Amesbury. "I'll have no more talk of this nonsense about tyranny from you. You have made yourself look ridiculous before our guest, Mr. Marbury, who has come here upon important business. Now, sir, asked Mr. Phipps, turning towards me, let us continue our discussion. You say you are in the market for a large quantity of tea for transport to the colonies. Indeed, replied I. I am under orders by my investors to purchase not less than 15 tons of Indian kaolin, at the right price. I see, said Mr. Phipps, and removed the newspapers. He put a pair of glass spectacles to his eye, and began reviewing. Now see here in the shipping news. There have been not fewer than 6 insurance claims filed this past fortnight. Mr. Phipps explained that this meant the supply of tea was reduced, and that therefore, during the forthcoming auction, tea would be dear, and so the price would rise in order to compensate demand. I inquired of Mr. Phipps what the price of tea should be at the auction. I shouldn't know it at a shilling, said Mr. Phipps, but surely more than £250 per tonnage. 250 per tonnage, I rejoined, calculating in my head that I should have the capital to purchase only 10 tons at such a price. No, that shan't do at all. I must have at the very least 12, nay, 15 tons. It just so happens that I have 20 contracts with a Dutch house to purchase Sri Lankan kaolin at £164 per ton. Thus, with these contracts, you have the right to buy 15 tons of kaolin at £160 per ton, for a total of £2,400. I told Mr. Phipps that this seemed like a proper arrangement, depending on the price with which he would let me have the contracts. At face value, these contracts are each worth 90 quid. That is, the difference between the market price and the price of the contracts. I calculated this sum in my head, and told Mr. Phipps that I should not be prepared to pay such a price, as it would deplete my capital beyond capacity to purchase the necessary quantity of tea. Nay, nor should you. You say you only need 15 tons, yeah? That's 1,300 quid, taken together at par, which I'll cut in half and round it off to make it more gentlemanly. 600 quid. I assure you, when your captain sees the listed price on the exchange, he will marvel at your ingenuity. I considered this proposition, and gave the baronet a look to see if he should like to comment on the exchange. And why, might I ask, would you be so inclined to do me such a service as to sell me a cargo of tea at so handsome a price? I have no interest in attending the auction, and am pleased enough with the profit, such as it is at this moment. I thus accepted this arrangement, without any great deal of quibbling over price, and Mr. Phipps explained to me that I must approach a Mr. Oswald Fitzroy of the East India Company to redeem their value.